In the spring of 612 before Christ, floodwaters from the swollen Kosa River tore through a section of the greatest defensive wall ever built, and within hours, an army of Babylonians and Medes poured into a city that had ruled the known world for nearly a century. Nineveh, capital of the Assyrian superpower, home to 100,000 souls, seat of kings who had conquered from the Nile Delta to the mountains of Iran, burned so completely that within 2 generations, no living person could say with certainty where it had stood. How does the mightiest city on earth vanish so thoroughly that soldiers march across its buried palaces without a glance downward? How does a metropolis encircled by 12 kilometers of walls, guarded by colossal stone creatures weighing 40 tons, served by the most advanced aqueduct system of the ancient world, simply cease to exist in human memory? This is the question that drives everything you are about to witness. What follows is the complete biography of Nineveh, told from its first breath to its last heartbeat and beyond. We begin 8,000 years ago, when the first farmers recognized the power of this ground, where the Kosa meets the Tigris on a broad Mesopotamian plain, and chose to raise their homes on twin mounds that offered both fertile soil and commanding views across the steppe. We trace the centuries when Nineveh grew into a sacred city of the goddess Ishtar, drawing pilgrims long before Assyria existed as a kingdom. We follow its transformation under Sennacherib, who demolished the old town and rebuilt it as something the world had never seen, a palace of 71 rooms lined with 3,000 meters of carved alabaster, walls thick enough to drive chariots upon, gates flanked by winged bulls with the faces of kings. We enter the library of Ashurbanipal, where 30,000 clay tablets preserved the accumulated knowledge of Mesopotamian civilization, texts of medicine, astronomy, mythology, and diplomacy that would sleep underground for 2.5 millennia. We walk the streets at the empire's zenith, through market quarters loud with metalworkers and brewers, past scribal schools where boys pressed reed into wet clay, along processional avenues leading to temples fragrant with cedar smoke. Then we witness the catastrophe, the siege, the flood, the fire, the deliberate annihilation of a civilization's beating heart. We stand in the silence that followed, centuries of grass growing over buried magnificence. And finally, we arrive at the moment in 1847 when Austin Henry Layard drove his spade into the mound called Kuyunjik and struck carved stone, and a lost world began its slow return to human knowledge. Nineveh matters because it was the first city to achieve a scale and ambition that would not be matched for 1,000 years after its destruction. Its library preserved the Epic of Gilgamesh, the oldest great story ever written, a narrative that would have been lost forever without those buried rooms. Its relief carvings invented a visual language of power that every empire since has echoed. Its engineering, its water systems, its urban planning pushed the boundaries of what humans believed a city could become. And all of it was erased so completely that for over 2,000 years, Nineveh existed only as a name in ancient texts, a warning whispered by prophets, a ghost that scholars debated had ever been real. If you find yourself drawn to complete journeys through the great cities of the ancient world, subscribe so you never miss what comes next. Each week we bring back to life a world built in mud brick, bronze, and carved stone, cities that shaped everything we are and then disappeared beneath the earth. Let us begin where all cities begin, with the ground itself, the rivers converging, the mounds rising from the plain, and the first human choice to build here and nowhere else. Long before any king carved his name into stone, long before the first temple rose on its summit, the mound existed. It stood where two rivers met, the great Tigris rolling south from the mountains of eastern Anatolia, and the smaller Kosa threading westward through limestone hills to join it. Their confluence created a wedge of land slightly elevated above the surrounding floodplain, a natural platform of compacted alluvial clay that would not wash away when the spring waters surged. This was the ground that became Nineveh. The logic of the place is older than civilization itself. The Tigris provided a highway of movement, connecting the rain-fed uplands of the north to the irrigated lowlands of the south. The Kosa offered a secondary channel into the foothills, where copper ore and building stone could be found. Between them, the soil was deep and dark, renewed each year by seasonal flooding, capable of sustaining barley and emmer wheat without elaborate canal systems. The twin mounds, the one later called Kuyunjik and the one known as Nebi Yunus, rose naturally above this plain, offering dry ground during floods and clear sight lines across the steppe in every direction. A settlement here could see danger approaching from a great distance. It could drink from two sources. It could farm without fear of drought. Sometime around 6,000 years before the Common Era, the first permanent inhabitants chose this ground. They were people of the Hassuna culture, makers of coarse but functional pottery, growers of grain, keepers of small herds. Their mud brick structures, modest and rectangular, left traces in the deepest excavated levels of Kuyunjik. Thin layers of packed earth, ash from cooking fires, fragments of hand-shaped vessels. Obsidian flakes found among these earliest deposits tell of contact with distant sources, likely the volcanic fields near Lake Van, hundreds of kilometers to the north. Even in this earliest phase, the settlement was not isolated. It sat on routes of exchange. By the 5th millennium, the culture had shifted. Halaf period pottery appears in the stratigraphic record. Elegant, thin-walled vessels painted with geometric patterns in red and black, their surfaces burnished to a soft sheen. These are among the finest ceramics of prehistoric Mesopotamia, evidence of specialized craft production and of a community wealthy enough to invest labor in beauty. The painted bowls and plates recovered from Kuyunjik connect Nineveh to a cultural horizon stretching from southeastern Turkey to the plains of northern Iraq, a shared world of symbols and techniques. Then came the Ubaid period, around 4,500 years before the Common Era, and with it a deepening of settlement. Architecture grew more substantial. Mud brick walls thickened. Storage facilities appeared, suggesting surplus grain and the social organization required to manage it. The mound itself began to rise, not through geology, but through the slow accumulation of human habitation, each generation building atop the compressed debris of the last. Layer upon layer, century upon century, the tell grew taller. By the late 4th millennium, Nineveh was no longer a village. It was becoming something more, a place where people gathered not only to live and farm, but to worship. The earliest traces of cultic activity on Kuyunjik suggest that the mound had acquired sacred meaning, that the high ground above the river junction was understood as a place where the human world touched something greater. The goddess who would later be called Ishtar may already have been present in some earlier form, her power rooted in the fertility of the land and the mystery of the waters that converged below. The mound waited. It had been chosen well. Everything that followed, the temples, the palaces, the walls, the library, the fire, began here, in river mud and silence, with the first hands pressing wet clay into the shape of a wall. By the 3rd millennium before the Common Era, the mound called Kuyunjik had risen higher still, not only from the slow accumulation of mud brick and ash, but from deliberate human effort. Layer upon layer of platform construction lifted the temple precinct above the surrounding plain, making it visible from the river roads that converged at the Tigris crossing. The shrine atop this artificial elevation belonged to Ishtar, goddess of war and desire, of the morning star and the evening star, of fertility and destruction held in a single divine hand. Her presence here was ancient, older than any written record that survives, but by the early Bronze Age her cult had transformed Nineveh from a farming settlement into a destination. Pilgrims came. They came from the upland valleys to the east and from the steppe towns along the Tigris corridor. They brought offerings, small clay figurines of women with exaggerated features, cylinder seals carved with scenes of worship, vessels of grain and oil left at the temple threshold. The Ishtar temple on Kuyunjik was not yet the grand structure later kings would build, but its sanctity was already established, its reputation spreading along the trade networks that carried obsidian, copper, and lapis lazuli across Mesopotamia. The Akkadian Empire, the first great unifier of the river lands under Sargon and his successors, recognized Nineveh's sacred importance. Manishtusu, son of Sargon of Akkad, left a building inscription recording his restoration of the Ishtar temple, one of the earliest written references to the city. This was no minor provincial gesture. An Akkadian king investing resources in Nineveh's shrine confirmed what the pilgrim traffic already demonstrated. The goddess here commanded reverence far beyond the local population. The temple received royal patronage because its spiritual authority was real, felt across the northern plains and into the mountain passes. During the centuries of the 3rd dynasty of Ur, when southern Mesopotamia dominated trade and administration, Nineveh maintained its identity through the temple. Gudea of Lagash, the pious governor who recorded his building projects in extraordinary detail, referenced materials flowing through northern networks that touched Nineveh's region, timber from the highlands, stone from the upper Tigris quarries. The city sat at a crossroads not only of rivers, but of commerce, and the temple was the institution that gave this crossroads permanence and meaning. Votive deposits excavated from the deep levels of Kuyunjik reveal the texture of worship across these centuries. Small bronze figurines of supplicants, hands clasped before their chests. Alabaster eye idols staring with enormous pupils toward the divine presence. Fragments of painted pottery placed as offerings beside mud brick altars. The smell of burning animal fat and cedar resin would have hung in the air of the precinct, mingling with the dust of the plain and the damp breath of the Kosa below. The temple grew. Each generation added courses of mud brick, replastered walls, renewed the sacred furnishings. The platform rose incrementally, century by century, so that by the early 2nd millennium, the Ishtar precinct dominated the skyline of a city that had grown to fill much of the mound's summit. Nineveh was not yet a political capital. That role belonged to Ashur, far to the south along the Tigris. But in sacred prestige, in the drawing power of its goddess, Nineveh held a position that no administrative decree could grant or revoke. Kings came to her. Armies sought her blessing before campaigns. Merchants left a portion of their profits at her gate. The city that would one day become the largest on earth began not with a king's ambition, but with a goddess's claim, a claim staked on high ground above converging waters, renewed in offerings and incense across more than 1,000 years of unbroken worship. Yet even as Ishtar's incense rose unbroken from Kuyunjik, the political ground beneath Nineveh shifted with each passing century. Around 1800 years before the Common Era, a conqueror arrived from the west, Shamshi-Adad, an Amorite warlord who seized the city of Ashur and built himself a kingdom stretching from the Zagros foothills to the banks of the Euphrates. His was the first great territorial state of Upper Mesopotamia, and Nineveh fell within its orbit not as a capital, but as a possession. Letters recovered from the palace at Mari, far downstream on the Euphrates, mention Nineveh in passing. A city of note, a place where the goddess still commanded reverence, but subordinate now to a king whose throne sat elsewhere. Shamshi-Adad stationed governors, collected grain taxes, and moved on. His interest lay in control, not in embellishment. The Ishtar temple received maintenance, perhaps modest renovation, but no grand rebuilding. Nineveh endured as it had always endured, through the constancy of its cult rather than the favor of any single ruler. When Shamshi-Adad's empire collapsed within a generation of his death, the city passed through decades of fragmented authority. Local rulers held the mound. Trade caravans still moved through, tin from the Iranian plateau bound for Anatolian markets, textiles flowing eastward, and Nineveh sat along these routes, collecting tolls, housing merchants in modest courtyard structures of mud brick and poplar beam. The old Assyrian trading networks centered on Ashur and its merchant colonies at Kanesh in central Anatolia, touched Nineveh only tangentially. The city was a waypoint, not a hub. Its architecture in this period reflects that status. No monumental construction, no palatial expansion, only the steady accumulation of residential layers and the quiet persistence of the temple precinct above. Then came a deeper shadow. By the 15th century before the Common Era, the kingdom of Mitanni, a Hurrian-speaking state ruled by an Indo-Aryan warrior aristocracy, dominated all of northern Mesopotamia from its heartland in the Kabul Triangle. Nineveh became a Mitanni vassal city. Excavation of these levels on Kuyunjik reveals Hurrian cultural influence in pottery forms, in personal names scratched onto administrative tablets, in the style of cylinder seals pressed into clay. The Ishtar temple continued to function. The Mitanni kings were pragmatic enough to honor local cults, but political authority flowed westward to Washukani, the Mitanni capital whose exact location remains uncertain even today. For nearly 2 centuries, Nineveh lived under this foreign canopy. The city did not decline. It simply waited. Its population tended fields along the Kosa, brewed barley beer in low-roofed workshops, shaped bronze tools in small foundries near the river gate. Children grew up speaking Hurrian alongside Akkadian. The mound rose another meter, another 2, as old houses crumbled and new ones were built atop the rubble. Far to the south, the city of Ashur, smaller, more exposed but fiercely independent in memory, nursed its own ambitions beneath Mitanni's weight. It was Ashur, not Nineveh, that would break free first. When the Mitanni state fractured under Hittite pressure from the west and internal succession wars, Assyrian kings seized their moment. But that liberation and the slow reassertion of Assyrian power over the upper Tigris belongs to the century that followed. For now, in the long quiet between 1800 and 1400 before the Common Era, Nineveh's story is one of patient survival, a sacred city governed by others, enriched modestly by trade, defined not by political power, but by the unbroken thread of ritual smoke rising from Ishtar's ancient house on the summit of the mound. The liberation came not from Nineveh, but from Ashur, 60 miles to the south. Around 1360 before the Common Era, Ashurbanipal I shook off Mitanni vassalage and declared himself a king who corresponded as an equal with Egypt's pharaoh. The Amarna letters preserve his voice, proud, calculating, demanding gold. With that single generation, Assyria stepped onto the stage of great powers, and every city in its heartland felt the change. Nineveh remained secondary. The political capital was Ashur, the sacred city of the god who gave the nation its name. Yet Nineveh's Ishtar temple, ancient beyond reckoning, its foundations sinking through millennia of accumulated debris, demanded royal attention. Ashurbanipal and his successors understood that legitimacy flowed from the gods, and Ishtar of Nineveh was among the oldest and most powerful deities in the Mesopotamian world. Building inscriptions from this period, record restorations, new mud brick courses laid over crumbling walls, fresh plaster smoothed across the cellar, cedar beams hauled from distant Lebanon to span the sanctuary roof. The scent of that timber, resinous, sharp, would have filled the sacred precinct for years. Under Tukulti-Ninurta I, who reigned from roughly 1243 to 1207 before the Common Era, Assyrian power reached its first imperial crescendo. He conquered Babylon itself, carrying the statue of Marduk north in triumph. His ambitions reshaped the landscape. He built an entirely new capital, Tukulti-Ninurta, across the Tigris from Ashur. Nineveh benefited from the empire's expanding wealth without bearing the burden of being its political center. Trade goods flowed through its gates, tin from the Iranian plateau, copper from Anatolia, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan passing hand to hand along routes older than memory. Middle Assyrian pottery from this era, buff-colored, wheel-made, decorated with geometric bands, fills the excavation storerooms, evidence of a prosperous urban population. Then came the centuries of contraction. The Bronze Age collapse, around 1170 before the Common Era, shattered kingdoms from Greece to Egypt. Assyria survived but shrank, its borders pressed inward by Aramaean tribal migrations, flooding the Syrian steppe and the Tigris Valley. Nineveh endured these lean decades as it had endured Mitanni rule, quietly, sustained by agriculture and cult. Revival arrived with Tiglath-Pileser I, who reigned from approximately 1114 to 1076 before the Common Era. His annals record campaigns in every direction, west to the Mediterranean, north into Nairi lands, east against mountain peoples. They also record something else, the king as hunter. Tiglath-Pileser boasts of killing 4 wild bulls, 10 elephants, and over 900 lions. Some of these hunts took place in the plains around Nineveh, where royal game parks may already have existed. His inscriptions mention restorations at Nineveh's Ishtar temple, confirming that even this warrior king acknowledged the sacred priority of the ancient mound. The earliest Assyrian relief carvings emerge from this era, crude compared to what would follow, but revolutionary in intent. Flat figures of kings grasping conquered enemies, gods standing on mountain symbols, ritual scenes flanking doorways. The impulse to narrate power in carved stone, which would reach its apex in Sennacherib's palace 3 centuries later, begins here in modest limestone panels. By 900 before the Common Era, Nineveh had survived 5 centuries of Middle Assyrian rule as a venerated cult city, a provincial administrative center, and a waypoint on the empire's northern trade arteries. Its walls were modest. Its palace was functional, not monumental. The Ishtar temple, restored repeatedly, remained its defining structure, the reason kings invested in a city that was not yet their capital. The mound of Kuyunjik rose higher with each rebuilding, each layer of collapsed mud brick compressed beneath the next generation's foundations. The city waited, accumulating depth, gathering sacred weight. The kings who would transform it utterly, who would raise walls visible from a day's march away and fill palace corridors with 3,000 meters of carved stone, had not yet been born. Those kings arrived not in Nineveh, but in Nimrud, ancient Kalhu, 20 miles to the south. Around 883 before the Common Era, Ashurbanipal II completed a transformation that announced a new age. He rebuilt Kalhu from a provincial town into a gleaming imperial seat, a vast palace complex whose walls blazed with carved stone reliefs depicting siege, tribute, and the sacred hunt. The throne room alone stretched nearly 50 meters, its alabaster panels showing the king beneath the winged disk of Ashur, flanked by protective spirits with eagle heads and human bodies. No Mesopotamian ruler had decorated interior walls on this scale before. The banquet celebrating the palace's inauguration reportedly fed nearly 70,000 guests over 10 days. Assyria was declaring itself not merely a kingdom, but a machine of conquest, administration, and spectacle. Nineveh watched from across the plain. It remained a royal city. Kings visited, hunted in its surrounding parklands, maintained the Ishtar temple with fresh inscriptions and offerings. But the capital's energy, its bureaucratic mass, its military staging grounds, belonged to Nimrud. Ashurnasirpal's son, Shalmaneser III, continued the expansion, campaigning from the Mediterranean coast to the marshes of southern Babylonia. His black obelisk, a 2-meter limestone pillar carved on all 4 sides, depicted tribute bearers from 5 conquered regions prostrating themselves before the Assyrian throne. Among them knelt Jehu of Israel, the earliest known depiction of a biblical figure. This monument stood at Nimrud, not Nineveh. The empire's documentary heart beat elsewhere. Yet Nineveh was not neglected. Its Ishtar temple received continued renovation through the 9th and 8th centuries. Administrative texts confirm that governors maintained the city's infrastructure, its granaries stayed provisioned, its garrison remained active. The cult of Ishtar at Nineveh held a prestige that even the capital at Nimrud could not replicate, a sanctity rooted in millennia of continuous worship, in the depth of the mound itself. Kings came to consult the goddess before campaigns. Priests maintained the ancient rituals in chambers whose foundations reached back through layers older than Assyria's memory. The empire's reach grew staggering. By the mid-8th century, Assyrian armies had campaigned across Anatolia, subjugated the Phoenician coast, extracted tribute from Cyprus, and pressed deep into the Zagros highlands. Provincial governors administered territories linked by royal roads, relay stations, and a courier system that could carry intelligence from the frontier to the capital within days. Iron weapons had replaced bronze across the military. Siege engines, battering rams sheathed in leather, mobile towers, undermining teams, made walled cities vulnerable as never before. The reliefs at Nimrud documented this machinery with clinical precision. Then, around 721 before the Common Era, Sargon II seized the throne and made a decision that bypassed Nineveh entirely. He would build a new capital from nothing, Dur-Sharrukin, the fortress of Sargon, on virgin ground 15 kilometers northeast of Nineveh. The complex rose over a decade, a walled enclosure of nearly 300 hectares, a palace on a raised citadel platform, monumental lamassu figures weighing up to 40 tons flanking its gates. Sargon poured the empire's wealth into limestone, gypsum, and cedar. The message was unmistakable. The king needed no inherited city, no ancient shrine. He would create his own sacred ground. Nineveh endured this slight as it had endured centuries of secondary status. The Ishtar temple still smoked with offerings. The mound of Kuyunjik still rose above the Kosar. And when Sargon died on a battlefield in Anatolia in 705 before the Common Era, his body unrecovered, his new city was considered cursed. His son would abandon Dur-Sharrukin without hesitation. He would turn instead to the ancient mound beside the Tigris, to the city that had waited through 3,000 years of accumulated silence, and he would remake it into the greatest metropolis the ancient world had ever seen. Sennacherib came to the throne in grief and fury. His father's corpse lay somewhere in the mountains of Anatolia, unburied, and the gleaming city Sargon had built from nothing stood tainted by that death. The new king turned his back on Dur-Sharrukin within months of his accession. He looked north along the Tigris to where the ancient mound of Kuyunjik rose above the Kosar, and he saw not a provincial shrine city, but the raw material for something the world had never witnessed. His building inscriptions, recovered from foundation deposits beneath the palace floors, record the scale of his ambition with bureaucratic precision. He ordered the demolition of the old royal residences on Kuyunjik. Entire neighborhoods were razed. The footprint of the existing palace was judged inadequate, and so Sennacherib extended the terrace southwestward, raising a new platform of sun-dried mud brick over 500,000 square meters of leveled ground. Laborers packed earth and rubble into retaining walls of limestone blocks, lifting the palace terrace high above the surrounding city, so that it commanded views across the plain to the Zagros foothills. The workforce was staggering. Deportees from conquered lands, Chaldeans, Arameans, peoples from the Zagros and the Levant, labored alongside Assyrian corvée workers. Sennacherib's own annals boast of the multitude set to work quarrying gypsum alabaster from the hills east of the Tigris, dragging slabs on wooden sledges lubricated with water and oil. Palace reliefs from later rooms depict exactly this process. Gangs of men hauling colossal stone blocks along prepared tracks, while overseers count and record. The structure that rose at this platform would be called the Palace Without Rival. 71 rooms arranged around great courtyards, their walls lined with over 3,000 meters of carved alabaster panels standing 2 to 3 meters high. Each slab was quarried, transported, dressed flat, carved in low relief by teams of master sculptors, then set into position against the mud brick core walls. The carving alone required years. Scenes of siege warfare, royal hunts, divine figures, and tributary processions unfolded in continuous narrative bands, a visual encyclopedia of Assyrian power meant to overwhelm every ambassador, vassal, and priest who walked these corridors. The throne room stood at the heart of the complex. Its entrance was flanked by colossal lamassu, human-headed winged bulls carved from single blocks of limestone, weighing up to 30 tons each. Beyond them, the walls depicted Sennacherib enthroned, receiving the spoils of conquered cities. Cedar beams from Lebanon spanned the ceiling, their undersides painted in geometric patterns of red, blue, and white. Bronze lion head fittings adorned the doorways. The floors were paved with massive gypsum slabs, some inscribed with curses against anyone who would damage or remove them. Sennacherib did not merely build a palace. He reimagined the entire city as a frame for that palace. Streets were widened and straightened by royal decree. A great royal road, 26 meters wide, was laid from the citadel gate into the heart of the city, and inscriptions warned that any citizen who encroached upon its breadth with private construction would be impaled upon his own rooftop. The king was remaking urban space itself, imposing geometric order on the organic tangle of an ancient settlement. The palace foundations still survive beneath the soil of Kuyunjik. Layard's workers in 1847 struck the first carved slabs just meters below the surface, and the rooms unfolded one after another in astonishing preservation. The mud brick walls had collapsed inward, sealing the reliefs beneath tons of earth. Fire had blackened many panels, but the images remained legible. Processions frozen mid-stride, soldiers scaling walls, rivers flowing with carved precision. What Sennacherib built to intimidate the living world survived instead to astonish the modern one. But the palace was only the heart. What Sennacherib built around it was something no Mesopotamian city had ever possessed, a defensive perimeter so vast and so deliberately monumental that it functioned simultaneously as fortification, propaganda, and sacred boundary. The wall circuit ran for nearly 12 kilometers, enclosing roughly 750 hectares of urban ground. Its construction required the labor of tens of thousands, prisoners of war, corvée workers, and skilled masons drawn from across the empire. The outer wall, called in Akkadian the wall whose brilliance overwhelms the enemy, rose to a height of roughly 25 meters, its base 15 meters thick. The core was sun-dried mud brick, millions of bricks stamped and stacked in courses, but the lower face was sheathed in dressed limestone blocks to resist battering rams and sappers. A second inner wall ran parallel, and between the two stretched a military corridor wide enough for chariots. Beyond the outer face, a broad moat drew water from the Koza, creating a continuous wet barrier that turned the entire city into a kind of island fortress. 15 gates pierced this circuit, each one a statement of imperial theology. The gates bore names: the Nergal Gate on the north, the Mashki Gate near the river, the Haltzi Gate on the south, the Shamash Gate facing east toward the sunrise. Each threshold was flanked by colossal lamassu figures, those human-headed winged bulls carved from single blocks of limestone weighing as much as 30 tons. Quarried from outcrops along the Tigris, these figures were dragged on sledges by hundreds of men, scenes depicted on the palace reliefs themselves. The lamassu stood with 5 legs, an optical device ensuring that from the front they appeared to stand firm, and from the side they appeared to stride forward. They were apotropaic guardians, divine sentinels warding off chaos at every point where the outside world crossed into the king's domain. The Nergal Gate survives in partial reconstruction today, its winged bulls still standing at the threshold, weathered but recognizable. The Mashki Gate, the gate of the watering place, opened toward the Tigris and served the movement of water and goods from the river. Each gate complex included flanking towers, vaulted passages and guard chambers, small fortresses embedded within the larger wall. Yet Sennacherib's most astonishing engineering lay not in stone walls, but in water. The city's population and its royal gardens demanded far more water than the Kosa alone could provide. The king ordered the construction of a canal system stretching more than 50 kilometers into the hills northeast of Nineveh, capturing streams and springs and channeling them toward the capital. At Jawan, where the canal crossed a limestone valley, his engineers built what remains the earliest known stone aqueduct in the world, a structure over 270 meters long, carried on pointed arches of dressed stone, with a waterproof channel lined in concrete-like morit. 2 million blocks of stone were fitted together with precision. An inscription carved at the site credits the work to Sennacherib and records the canal's purpose, to bring mountain water into the orchards and gardens of Nineveh. Those gardens flourished within the walls. The Bavian rock reliefs, carved into a cliff face near the canal's headwaters, depict the king standing before gods and flowing water, celebrating the achievement. Inside the city, channels fed parks planted with exotic trees, cotton, olive, and species brought from campaigns in distant lands. The air within the walls carried the scent of irrigated greenery, an engineered paradise in the Mesopotamian heat. The walls, the gates, the moat, the aqueduct, together they transformed Nineveh from a city into a self-contained world, armored in stone and sustained by captured rivers. Every traveler approaching from any direction encountered the same message: the colossal guardians at the gates, the sheer height of mud brick and limestone climbing towards the sky, the glint of water in the moat. This was not merely defense. It was architecture as domination, infrastructure as theology. The walls declared that within them stood the center of the earth, and that the king who built them commanded not only armies, but the rivers themselves. Inside those walls, beyond the colossal guardians and across the paved courtyards, the palace itself unfolded. Room after room after room, 71 chambers in the southwest palace alone, their walls lined with carved gypsum alabaster slabs standing 2 to 3 meters high. The stone came from quarries at Balatai, floated downriver on rafts, then dragged on sledges to the construction site where teams of sculptors worked the soft mineral with iron chisels and copper-tipped drills. Each slab was carved in situ, fitted against the mud brick core wall, its surface worked into low relief depicting the deeds of the king and the submission of the world. The program was not decorative, it was narrative theology rendered in stone. A visitor entering the throne room encountered first the figure of the king, flanked by winged genii performing purification rites, their pine cones dipped in sacred water, their bucket-shaped bandudu vessels held aloft. Above the carved panels, painted plaster continued the imagery, Rosettes, palmettes, borders of blue and red and white against deep backgrounds. Cedar beams from Lebanon spanned the ceiling, their undersides carved and painted, filling the upper darkness with geometric precision. Bronze lion weights sat on administrative tables. The smell of the wood mingled with lamp oil and the faint mineral dust of freshly carved stone. Beyond the throne room, the palace branched into sequences designed for specific audiences. Foreign ambassadors passed through corridors showing Assyrian military victories, siege towers rolling against walled cities, battering rams, splintering gates, defenders tumbling from parapets. The message required no translation. Room 36 held the most elaborate single narrative, the siege and capture of Lachish in Judah, taken by Sennacherib in 701 before the Common Era. 11 continuous slabs depicted the assault in meticulous sequence, sappers undermining walls, archers loosing volleys from behind wicker shields, siege engines climbing earthen ramps, the city burning, prisoners marching out barefoot in long files, their possessions loaded onto ox carts. At the composition's climax, Sennacherib sat enthroned on a hillside, reviewing the spoils, an inscription above him confirming the scene's specificity. This was not generic conquest. This was a particular city on a particular day, carved so that every future visitor would know exactly what resistance cost. Other rooms served other purposes. The garden panels showed landscapes of extraordinary detail, trees of identifiable species, water channels flowing through terraced hillsides, pavilions set among cultivated groves. Administrative quarters held archives on clay tablets recording tribute, rations, correspondence with provincial governors, and intelligence reports from the empire's borders. Storerooms contained bronze fittings, ivory inlays, and glass vessels taken as plunder from campaigns stretching from Elam to the Mediterranean coast. The construction technique itself reveals the scale of ambition. Workers carved the reliefs working from the top of each slab downward, standing on earth platforms that were gradually removed as the carving descended. Tool marks showed different hands, master sculptors executing faces and musculature, apprentices filling background details of landscape and architecture. Some slabs bear faint guidelines scratched into the surface before carving began, evidence of a planned compositional program overseen by a master designer whose name is lost. Light entered these rooms through high, clear-story openings and through doorways aligned to catch morning sun. But much of the palace lived in controlled shadow, its carved surfaces emerging from dimness as oil lamps were carried past, figures appearing to move as the light shifted across their shallow relief. The effect was deliberate. The palace was not meant to be seen all at once, but experienced as a journey, each threshold revealing another chapter of royal power, another demonstration that the king who built these walls commanded stone, river, forest, army, and the labor of nations. That palace of shadow and carved stone would outlive its creator by only a few months. In the winter of 681 before the Common Era, Sennacherib was murdered inside Nineveh, struck down, according to both Assyrian and biblical sources, by his own sons. The killing took place in a temple, possibly the very sanctuary of the god Ninurta. The empire that had been governed from those 71 alabaster rooms plunged into civil war. The son who emerged victorious was not among the assassins. Esarhaddon, the youngest and designated heir, marched from the western provinces with loyal troops and defeated his brother's forces in 6 weeks. He entered Nineveh as king in the spring of 680 before the Common Era, stepping over the political wreckage of fratricide into a capital still stained by his father's blood. His first great act was not construction, but restoration, and not at Nineveh. Sennacherib had destroyed Babylon in 689, razing its temples and diverting canals to flood the sacred precinct. The act had horrified the Mesopotamian world. Esarhaddon reversed it entirely. He ordered Babylon rebuilt, its Esagila temple complex restored, its cult statue of Marduk returned. The political calculation was precise. By healing the wound his father had inflicted, Esarhaddon bound the south to Assyrian rule through piety rather than terror alone. At Nineveh itself, he expanded the military infrastructure. The Ekel Mashati, the arsenal palace, rose in the southwestern quarter of the city, a vast compound for storing weapons, chariots, horse tackle, and campaign supplies. Its mud-brick walls enclosed parade grounds and armory halls where bronze-scale armor was stacked and iron lance heads sorted by the thousands. This was the logistical engine behind the empire's most audacious campaign. In 671 before the Common Era, Esarhaddon marched an Assyrian army across the Sinai and into the Nile Delta. Memphis fell. The pharaoh Taharqa fled south. For the first time in history, a Mesopotamian king held Egypt. Victory stelae carved at the Nile depicted Esarhaddon towering over kneeling captive princes, the double crown of Egypt rendered beneath Assyrian divine symbols. Copies of these monuments were erected at Samol in southern Anatolia, and likely within Nineveh's own ceremonial spaces. The empire now stretched from Thebes to the Zagros Mountains, from the marshes of the Persian Gulf to the cedar forests of Lebanon. Nineveh sat at the center of this arc like a spider in its web. Courier roads radiated outward in every direction. Intelligence reports arrived on clay tablets from provincial governors in Egypt, Phoenicia, Elam, and the Median highlands. The royal chancery processed loyalty oaths, the vassal treaties that bound subject kings to the Assyrian crown. Copies of these succession treaties, ensuring allegiance to Esarhaddon's chosen heirs, were later found at Nimrud, their cuneiform text specifying punishments for disloyalty in language of extraordinary violence. But the body that had conquered Egypt was failing. Esarhaddon suffered from a chronic illness, possibly lupus, based on descriptions in royal correspondence of skin lesions, fevers, and periods of seclusion. Court physicians prescribed rituals and herbal remedies documented on tablets found in later palace archives. Substitute king rituals were performed, where a commoner sat briefly on the throne to absorb evil omens meant for the true monarch. In 669 before the Common Era, Esarhaddon died on the march, attempting a second Egyptian campaign. His body never reached Nineveh, but his succession plan held. The empire passed intact to his 2 sons, Ashurbanipal receiving Assyria, Shamash-shum-ukin receiving Babylon. The division was deliberate, meant to prevent the fratricidal chaos that had marked his own accession. Nineveh received its dead king's legacy not as ruin, but as momentum. The arsenal stood stocked. The walls stood unbreached. The courier network still pulsed with intelligence from 30 provinces. The city had survived assassination, civil war, and the death of a second king in 13 years, and it had grown stronger through each crisis. The administrative machinery Esarhaddon refined, the treaty system, the provincial reporting structure, the arsenal logistics, made Nineveh not merely a royal residence, but the operational brain of the largest empire the ancient world had yet produced. Ashurbanipal inherited that momentum and transformed it into something no Mesopotamian king had attempted before, the systematic collection of all recorded knowledge. He had been trained not as heir, but as scholar. His elder brothers were groomed for war. The young prince learned cuneiform in the scribal academy, mastering Sumerian and Akkadian, reading omens, copying literary texts. When fate and assassination placed the crown on his head in 668 before the Common Era, he brought to the throne a literate mind rare among warrior kings, and he turned Nineveh into the archive of civilization. On the northern edge of Kuyunjik, Ashurbanipal raised his own palace, the North Palace, smaller than his grandfather's Colossus to the south, but exquisite in its decoration. Its rooms were lined with the finest relief carving Assyria ever produced. Here the famous lion hunt sequence unfolds across gypsum panels with a naturalism that still stuns, the muscled tension of a leaping lion, the arrows buried deep in flesh, and most haunting of all, the dying lioness dragging paralyzed hindquarters, her mouth open in what seems almost a cry. These were not mere decoration. They were theological statements, the king as guardian of cosmic order, subduing chaos in its animal form within a controlled arena. But the palace's deepest treasure lay in 2 chambers on its upper floor. Here Ashurbanipal assembled his library, over 30,000 cuneiform tablets and fragments gathered from temples and scribal schools across Babylonia, Assyria, and beyond. Royal agents carried explicit orders: copy every text, bring the original if possible. The collection was catalogued with systematic precision. Tablets bore colophons identifying their series, their tablet number within that series, their source, and their scribe. Literary works filled entire shelves, the 12 tablets of the Epic of Gilgamesh, the creation epic Enuma Elish, the descent of Ishtar to the underworld. Medical compendia listed symptoms and treatments across dozens of tablets. Astronomical diaries recorded celestial observations spanning centuries. Omen series as the great compendium Enuma Anu Enlil alone ran to 70 tablets, codified the reading of divine will in stars, livers, births, and weather. The tablets rested on wooden shelving, organized by subject, each shelf labeled with a brief clay tag. Scribes worked in adjacent rooms, copying damaged exemplars onto fresh clay, their reed styluses pressing wedge-shaped marks into surfaces still damp. The smell of wet clay and the faint dust of dried tablets filled these corridors, the scent of accumulated centuries rendered portable, storable, retrievable. This was not mere royal vanity. The library functioned as an instrument of power. Omen texts allowed the king's diviners to interpret every anomaly: an eclipse, a monstrous birth, a bird flying left, and advise action. Medical texts kept the royal household alive. Treaty archives preserved the legal architecture of empire. Ashurbanipal understood that knowledge was governance, that the scribe's stylus underwrote the soldier's spear. Beyond the library, the North Palace's garden scene relief shows the king reclining with his queen beneath grapevines, drinking from shallow bowls, attended by musicians and fan-bearers. From a nearby tree hangs the severed head of the Elamite king Tumen, a chilling juxtaposition of leisure and terror that captures the Assyrian imperial mind with perfect clarity. At its cultural zenith around 650 before the Common Era, Nineveh held within its walls not only the largest army and the tallest ramparts, but the deepest reservoir of written memory in the ancient world. Every myth, every prayer, every star chart, every diplomatic letter, gathered, copied, shelved, and guarded. The city had become the mind of an empire, and that mind remembered everything. But the mind of an empire required a body, and that body was the city itself, teeming with life behind its 12 kilometers of fortification. At its peak between 700 and 630 before the Common Era, Nineveh held perhaps 100,000 souls within its walls, making it almost certainly the largest city on earth. Those souls needed to be fed, housed, employed, governed, and kept in order. The administrative tablets recovered from palace archives reveal the machinery that made this possible. Ration lists recording barley distributions to thousands of workers, inventories of oil and wool, rosters of craftsmen organized by trade and quarter. The residential districts spread south and east of the palace mound, a dense fabric of courtyard houses built from sun-dried mud brick, their flat roofs layered with packed earth and reed matting. Each house turned inward around a central court open to the sky, where cooking fires burned and bread ovens, tannour ovens, cylindrical and clay-lined, produced the flat loaves that formed the base of every meal. Skeletal remains from burial contexts beneath house floors show a population marked by heavy labor. Arthritic joints, worn teeth ground down by stone-milled flour, healed fractures suggesting lives of physical intensity. The market quarters clustered near the major gates, where traffic from the empire's provinces converged. Metalworkers occupied dedicated streets, their workshops identifiable by slag deposits and crucible fragments. Bronze smiths cast weapons, tools, and decorative fittings. Iron, still relatively precious, was worked for military blades and agricultural implements. Textile production employed thousands, women primarily, according to the ration lists, spinning wool and weaving on horizontal looms, producing the fabrics that served both as clothing and as units of exchange across Assyrian trade networks. Brewers operated throughout the city. Mesopotamian beer, thick and nutritious, brewed from barley bread fermented in large ceramic vats, was not luxury but daily sustenance. Administrative records allocate beer rations alongside grain, confirming its centrality to the urban diet. The smell of fermenting mash would have hung over entire neighborhoods, mingling with the smoke of cooking fires, the acrid tang of metalworking, and the ever-present dust of mud brick construction and repair. The Ishtar temple on Kuyunjik remained the city's sacred heart. Festival processions wound from the temple precinct through the main streets. The goddess carried on her palanquin, priests in ritual garments, musicians with drums and lyres, the population lining the route. These festivals punctuated the agricultural calendar and reinforced the cosmic order that Assyrian ideology placed at the center of imperial legitimacy. Scribal training continued in schools attached to temples and palace administration. Young apprentices learned by copying sign lists onto practice tablets. Hundreds of these student exercises survive, their wobbly wedge marks betraying uncertain hands. The curriculum moved from simple syllabaries through Sumerian literary texts to the complex genres of divination, medicine, and royal correspondence. A trained scribe might serve decades in the bureaucracy that kept the empire functioning. Military garrisons occupied the arsenal complex, the Ekal Mashati, on the city's eastern edge. Soldiers drilled, horses were stabled and trained, chariots maintained. The standing army required constant provisioning, and supply tablets record the movement of grain, straw, and fodder in enormous quantities. This was the engine that projected Assyrian power from Egypt to Elam, and its fuel was drawn from the labor of every farmer, brewer, weaver, and smith within these walls. The city breathed as a single organism, consuming, producing, worshipping, training, all of it sustained by the rivers, the soil, and the relentless administrative will, pressed into wet clay and filed in palace storerooms. That organism began to die from within. Ashurbanipal vanished from the historical record around 631 before the Common Era. Whether through death or incapacity, the cuneiform sources fall silent. What followed was not a graceful transition, but a hemorrhage. The succession fractured between his sons, Ashur-etil-ilani and Sin-shar-ishkun, and possibly a general named Sin-shumu-lishir, who seized power briefly. Civil war consumed the heartland. The administrative machinery that had coordinated grain shipments, troop deployments, and tribute collection across 3,000 kilometers of territory stuttered and failed. Provincial governors watched the center tear itself apart and calculated their own futures. Babylon moved first. The Chaldean Nabopolassar had been fighting Assyrian garrisons in the southern marshlands for years. In 626 before the Common Era, he seized the throne of Babylon and declared independence. The Babylonian Chronicle, a terse year-by-year record inscribed on clay tablets now in the British Museum, documents what followed with cold precision. Assyrian armies marched south repeatedly, fighting along the Euphrates and the Tigris, winning engagements, but never delivering a decisive blow. Each campaign drained manpower from a shrinking pool. Egypt, conquered barely 40 years earlier, had already slipped away under Psamtik I, who expelled Assyrian garrisons by 655. The western provinces, Syria, the Levantine coast, loosened their bonds. Tribute ceased to arrive. The bronze and grain and horses that had fed the imperial machine thinned to a trickle. To the east, a transformation equally fatal was underway. The Medes, long fragmented into competing tribal groups across the Zagros highlands, unified under Hyaxares. He reorganized their armies along disciplined lines, spearmen, archers, cavalry operating as coordinated units rather than tribal war bands. By 615, Median forces were probing the Assyrian frontier, testing the weakened garrisons that once had held the mountain passes inviolate. The killing blow against the old sacred capital came in 614. Cyaxares led his army down from the highlands and fell upon Ashur, the ancient city, the god's own seat, the place from which the empire took its name. The Babylonian Chronicle records that the Medes stormed the city and carried off vast spoil. Nabopolassar arrived too late for the battle, but met Cyaxares among the ruins. There, amid the shattered temples of a city that had been holy for 2,000 years, the two kings sealed an alliance. Tradition holds it was cemented by a dynastic marriage. The pact was simple in its purpose: the destruction of what remained of Assyrian power. Sin-shar-ishkun still held Nineveh. The great walls still stood. The 15 gates still closed each night. The moat still carried water from the Kosa. But the empire beyond those walls had contracted to a shadow, a strip of territory along the upper Tigris, a few loyal cities, a diminishing army. The storerooms that once held tribute from Egypt to Elam now held only what the immediate hinterland could provide. The administrative tablets from these final years grow sparse, their script sometimes hurried, their contents desperate, requests for troops, pleas for loyalty, inventories of dwindling supplies. The city that had commanded the world now stood nearly alone, its walls encircling not an empire's heart, but a besieged remnant. The coalition armies were gathering. The spring of 612 approached, and with it the seasonal rains that would swell the Kosa beyond its banks. Nineveh's 12 kilometers of fortification, built to overawe the world, would face their single and final test. They came from the south and from the east, two armies converging on the upper Tigris plain in the early months of 612 before the Common Era. Nabopolassar brought the Babylonian forces north along the river road, seasoned troops who had spent a decade clawing Mesopotamia free from Assyrian control. Cyaxares led the Medes down from the Zagros passes, cavalry and infantry hardened by the destruction of Ashur 2 years prior. A third contingent joined them, Scythian horsemen, mobile and brutal, sweeping across the open steppe. The Babylonian Chronicle, our most reliable witness, records their arrival before the walls of Nineveh in the month of Simanu, roughly corresponding to June. The siege lasted approximately 3 months. Those 12 kilometers of fortification, Sennacherib's masterwork, 25 meters high, 15 meters thick at the base, fronted by a moat fed by the Kosa, held. The coalition raised siege ramps against the outer defenses. Battering engines were brought forward. Sin-shar-ishkun commanded the garrison within, and for weeks the walls did what walls were built to do. The 15 gates remained shut. The Lamassu guardians stared outward with their ancient calm. Then the river betrayed the city it had nourished for millennia. The Babylonian Chronicle states that the river's flood carried away part of the wall. The seasonal rains of that spring swelled the Kosa beyond all containment. Water surged against the mud-brick core where the stream passed through the fortification circuit, softening the sun-dried brick, undermining foundations that had stood for nearly a century. A section collapsed. The breach opened like a wound in the city's flank, and through it poured the armies of the coalition. What followed was not conquest, but annihilation. The attackers swept through the residential quarters, the temple precincts, the administrative buildings. Archaeological excavation has revealed what the Chronicle only summarizes: thick layers of ash and charred debris blanketing the palace floors, collapsed roofing beams of cedar carbonized to black stumps, gypsum reliefs cracked and reddened by intense heat. In the palace without rival, fire consumed the wooden ceiling structures and brought tons of mud-brick superstructure crashing down upon the carved panels below. Skeletal remains found in gateway passages and along streets show evidence of violent death. Unburied bodies left where they fell. Sin-shar-ishkun perished. Later tradition, preserved by the Greek historian Diodorus drawing on earlier sources, claims he immolated himself within his burning palace rather than face capture. The chronicle is less dramatic but no less final. It records simply that a great defeat was inflicted, and the king disappeared from history. The destruction was systematic and deliberate. The coalition did not occupy Nineveh. They gutted it. The temples of Ishtar and Nabu were torn apart. The palace reliefs, those thousands of meters of carved narrative celebrating Assyrian supremacy, were left buried under rubble and flame-scarred debris. The great gates were broken. The walls, already breached by flood, were left unrepaired. The moat silted. The canals that had fed the royal gardens ceased to flow. The prophet Nahum had declared it, an overflowing flood would make a complete end of the place. Whether prophecy or observation written after the fact, the words matched the reality with terrible precision. In the month of Abu, approximately August of 612, the coalition completed its work. The administrative heart of the greatest empire the ancient Near East had known ceased to exist in a single summer. The silence that followed would last more than 2,000 years. That silence settled fast. Within a decade of the destruction, the remnants of the Assyrian court at Haran had been swept away by the same Babylonian and Median forces that had broken Nineveh. The last Assyrian king to claim the title, Ashurbanipal II, vanished from the record after 609 before the Common Era, defeated at the town of Haran with his Egyptian allies unable to save him. The dynasty that had ruled the ancient world for 3 centuries ended not with a final stand at its capital, but with a minor engagement on the Syrian steppe, barely noted by the victors. The conquerors had no interest in rebuilding what they had destroyed. Nabopolassar and his successors turned their attention to Babylon, pouring resources into Marduk's city. The Medes withdrew eastward into their highland domains. Nineveh was left to the wind and the river. The Kosa, no longer channeled through maintained canals, spread across its floodplain in seasonal surges, depositing layers of fine alluvial silt against the broken walls and into the roofless halls of the palaces. Mud brick, the material of nearly every structure in the city, dissolved back into the earth from which it had been shaped. Within a generation, the residential quarters had melted into low ridges. Within a century, the great platform of the southwest palace was a hill of compacted debris, its carved alabaster panels sealed beneath meters of collapsed superstructure and wind-blown soil. Grass colonized the mounds. Kuyunjik and Nebi Yunus became landmarks of a different kind, twin tells rising from the Tigris plain, their contours softened, their origins increasingly uncertain to those who passed beneath them. When Xenophon led the remnants of the 10,000 northward along the Tigris in 401 before the Common Era, he recorded 2 ruined cities. One he called Mespila, describing massive stone foundations and walls of enormous extent. Most scholars identify this with Nineveh. Xenophon attributed the ruins to the Medes and noted that the inhabitants had long since departed. He expressed no awareness that he was walking past the administrative center of the most powerful empire his world had ever produced. The knowledge had been lost in less than 2 centuries. The centuries that followed deepened the burial. Alexander passed through Mesopotamia without remarking on the site. The Seleucids and Parthians established settlements nearby, and a small community persisted on or near Nebi Yunus, but the name Nineveh survived primarily in biblical tradition and in the writings of Greek and Roman authors who treated it as a symbol of vanished grandeur. Diodorus Siculus repeated legends of its enormous dimensions. Lucian mentioned it as a place that no longer existed. The city had become a literary abstraction, a cautionary tale detached from any physical location that living people could identify with certainty. Arab geographers of the medieval period came closer. Writers of the 10th and 12th centuries described the mounds opposite Mosul, which had grown into a prosperous city on the Tigris's western bank. Some correctly associated the eastern tales with ancient Nineveh. The mound of Nebi Yunus bore a shrine to the prophet Jonah, preserving a thread of sacred memory that connected the Islamic and biblical traditions to the buried Assyrian city beneath. Villagers farmed the slopes of Kuyunjik. Shepherds grazed flocks where Sennacherib's throne room lay sealed under 5 meters of earth. European travelers began arriving in the 17th century. Benjamin of Tudela had noted the site as early as the 12th century. By the 1800s, Claudius Rich, the British resident in Baghdad, surveyed the mounds in 1820, measuring their circumference, sketching their profiles, and collecting bricks stamped with cuneiform signs he could not yet read. He sensed the scale of what lay beneath, but lacked the means to excavate. The mounds waited, patient and immense, holding within their compacted layers the carved stone records of an empire, the library of a king, and the bones of a city that had once commanded the world from the Nile to the mountains of Iran. 22 years after Rich's survey, the first spade would finally break the surface of Kuyunjik. In 1842, Paul-Émile Botta, the French consul at Mosul, drove his workers' picks into the surface of Kuyunjik. The results were disappointing. Fragments of brick, scattered potsherds, nothing monumental. Frustrated, Botta shifted his attention 14 kilometers northeast to Khorsabad, where he uncovered the palace of Sargon II. Kuyunjik's deeper secrets remained untouched. 5 years later, a young Englishman named Austen Henry Layard returned to the mound with modest funds from the British Museum and a conviction that something extraordinary lay within. On his very first day of serious excavation, his trenches struck carved alabaster. Within weeks, room after room of Sennacherib's palace without rival began emerging from the compacted earth, colossal winged bulls flanking doorways, their bearded human faces staring out after 25 centuries of burial, and wall after wall of carved reliefs depicting siege warfare, royal hunts, and processions of tribute-bearers. Layard's workers hauled massive slabs from trenches cut through meters of collapsed mud brick and wind-deposited soil. The Lachish siege panels emerged intact, their carved soldiers scaling walls and impaling captives with a precision that stunned Victorian London when the reliefs arrived at the British Museum. Between 1847 and 1851, Layard excavated over 70 rooms, shipping tons of carved gypsum alabaster down the Tigris on rafts to Basra and onward to England. The scale of what he revealed, corridor after corridor of narrative stone carving, bronze fittings green with age, glazed brick thresholds still holding their color, transformed European understanding of the ancient Near East overnight. Hormuzd Rassam, an Assyrian Christian from Mosul who had served as Layard's assistant, took over excavation in 1853 and made the single most consequential discovery in the history of Mesopotamian archaeology. Tunneling into the North Palace of Ashurbanipal on Kuyunjik, he broke into chambers where thousands of cuneiform tablets lay heaped in the debris of collapsed shelving. The royal library, buried since the fire of 612 before the Common Era. The tablets travelled to the British Museum in crates, where they sat largely unread until 1872, when George Smith, a self-taught engraver turned Assyriologist, pieced together a Babylonian account of a great flood, strikingly parallel to the biblical narrative of Noah. The text belonged to the 11th tablet of the Epic of Gilgamesh. Smith's public reading before the Society of Biblical Archaeology caused a sensation that reached every newspaper in Europe. The Daily Telegraph funded his return to Nineveh, where he found the missing fragment within days, an act of archaeological fortune almost beyond belief. Reginald Campbell Thompson conducted the first systematic stratigraphic excavations between 1927 and 1932, cutting deep soundings through Kuyunjik that revealed occupation layers stretching back to the 6th millennium before the Common Era, Hassuna, Halaf, Ubaid, Uruk, confirming Nineveh's extraordinary antiquity beneath its Assyrian grandeur. Iraqi archaeologists continued work through the mid-20th century, excavating the Nergal Gate and restoring sections of the city wall. Then destruction returned. In 2015, forces occupying Mosul bulldozed the Nergal Gate's reconstructed Lamassu and filmed the demolition of reliefs still in situ on Kuyunjik. Damage to Nebi Yunus, the second mound, inadvertently exposed a previously unknown palace of Esarhaddon beneath a destroyed shrine. The stones that survived fire in 612 before the Common Era faced sledgehammers 26 centuries later. International teams now work alongside Iraqi colleagues to document, stabilize, and protect what remains. Nineveh holds UNESCO World Heritage status, and its carved panels fill the galleries of the British Museum and the Iraq Museum in Baghdad, silent witnesses to an empire that once commanded the known world from these twin mounds above the Tigris. The dust of Kuyunjik still holds tablets unread, rooms unexcavated, and stories untold. The city that was built to last forever, destroyed in a single season, and buried for 2 millennia continues to speak, in carved stone, in pressed clay, in the slow, patient grammar of archaeology. Thank you for journeying through the full arc of Nineveh's story, from its first Neolithic settlers to the archaeologists who brought its stones back into the light. If this series has deepened your sense of the ancient world, consider subscribing so you will not miss the next city we explore together.